by the time Money Heist reached season 4, this wasn't just a Spanish crime series anymore. It had become a worldwide obsession. The red jumpsuits were everywhere. The Dali masks had become instantly recognizable. And millions of viewers were waiting to find out one thing. Would the professor's gang actually survive the Bank of Spain? Season 4 picked up right in the middle of the chaos. The professor was losing control. Lisbon was being held by the police. Nairobi was fighting for her life. And inside the Bank of Spain, the gang was beginning to realize that this robbery was going to cost them far more than money. But while the characters were fighting to survive on screen, the actors behind them were entering a completely different chapter of their careers. Some became international stars. Some took on completely unexpected roles. And a few of them became so closely connected with Money Heist that it's almost impossible to imagine anyone else playing their characters. So today, we're going back to Money Heist Season 4, looking at 10 important faces from this chapter of the story, and seeing where their careers have taken them in 2026. And if you enjoy these journeys through iconic movies and series, subscribe and become part of our movie family. We don't just tell you what happened to the characters. We follow the actors behind them. Let's begin with the woman who somehow finds herself in the middle of almost every disaster. 1. Úrsula Corberó, Tokyo never really had an off switch. Even when the professor had a plan, Tokyo had a way of making things complicated. And Season 4 was probably one of the clearest examples of that. Inside the Bank of Spain, Tokyo was caught between the gang's mission and her own emotions. She was impulsive, fearless, and sometimes incredibly frustrating. But that's exactly why people connected with her. She didn't feel like a perfect action hero. She felt human. She made terrible decisions. She lost people she loved. She got angry. She panicked. And then somehow she kept going. That became one of Úrsula Corberó's biggest strengths as an actress. She didn't play Tokyo as someone who was always brave. She played her as someone who was afraid and still moved forward. And outside Money Heist, Corberó's career took a huge leap. She went from being a familiar face in Spanish television to an internationally recognized actress, appearing in projects such as Snake Eyes and Lift. She's also become a major fashion figure, regularly appearing at international events and campaigns. His relationship with Argentine actor Chino Darín was one of the most closely followed celebrity relationships surrounding the Money Heist cast. They were together for several years before announcing their separation in 2025, ending a relationship that had lasted nearly 8 years. As for money, online estimates vary considerably, so there's no reliable public figure that can honestly be presented as her exact net worth. What isn't difficult to measure is how much her career changed. Before Tokyo, she was a successful Spanish actress. After Tokyo, she became a global star. And if Tokyo was the emotional storm inside the Bank of Spain, the man controlling everything outside was about to face his biggest crisis yet. 2. Álvaro Morte. The professor had spent years preparing for every possible disaster. Police intervention? He had a plan. Hostage rebellion? He had a plan. The gang getting trapped? He had another plan. But Season 4 introduced something that even Sergio Marquina couldn't completely control. Emotion. The professor was no longer sitting safely outside the operation. He was becoming personally involved in everything. Lisbon's capture pushed him to the edge. Nairobi's condition destroyed his confidence. And then came the discovery that the police were willing to go further than he had ever imagined. For the first time, the man who always seemed 10 steps ahead looked genuinely lost. And Álvaro Morte played that breakdown beautifully. The professor wasn't suddenly weak. He was simply human. That's one reason Morte's performance worked so well. He understood that the character didn't need to shout to show fear. Sometimes a pause or a look was enough. Since Money Heist, Morte has built an increasingly international career. He's appeared in Spanish and international productions and has moved into producing as well. And his post-Money Heist projects show that he isn't interested in playing the same character forever. In 2026, Netflix's international projects continue to feature Morte, including 9 Queens, a new series based on the acclaimed Argentine film, in which he stars alongside Patrick Criado. It's actually a strangely perfect project for him. Another story about deception. Another world where nobody is quite who they appear to be. But While the professor was trying to keep everyone alive from outside, someone inside the Bank of Spain was waiting for the moment she could finally return. 3. Itziar, Ituño. Lisbon Raquel Murillo had already crossed the biggest line of her life. She had fallen in love with the man she was supposed to arrest. Now, in Season 4, she had become Lisbon. And getting her back into the Bank of Spain wasn't easy. The professor had to create an elaborate plan to convince the police that Lisbon had been transported somewhere else. It was one of those moments where Money Heist reminded us why its storytelling became so addictive. You think you know what's happening, and then the show completely changes the situation. Itziar Ituño had already proven that she could play Raquel as a strong police officer. But Lisbon required something different. She had to look like someone who had completely accepted her new life, while still carrying the memories of the woman she used to be. That balance became one of her best performances in the series. And while Money Heist made her internationally famous, Ituño continued working beyond the franchise. She's remained active in Spanish television, film, and theater, and has also been involved in social and humanitarian causes. Unlike some of her co-stars, she never tried to completely separate herself from Lisbon. She understands how important the character was to audiences, but she also continued building a career beyond her most famous role. And then there's the personal side. Ituño has generally kept her private life much quieter than many international celebrities, which means there's far less reliable information about her relationships. And that's probably intentional. Sometimes not knowing everything about an actor's private life is actually a good thing. It lets the work stay in the spotlight. But if Lisbon represented the future of the gang, the next character represented its past. And somehow, even after death, Berlin was still influencing everything. 4. Pedro Alonso. Berlin wasn't supposed to be there. He was dead, but somehow, he was still everywhere. Through flashbacks, memories, and the professor's plans, Berlin remained one of the most important figures in the entire story. And Season 4 continued reminding us just how deep his influence went. Pedro Alonso had created a character who was arrogant, dangerous, charming, funny, and occasionally impossible to understand. That's a difficult combination. Most villains are easy to hate. Berlin wasn't. You could disagree with him completely and still find yourself watching whenever he entered a scene. That's the power of Pedro Alonso's performance. And after Money Heist, something incredible happened. Berlin became important enough to receive his own spin-off. The Netflix series Berlin brought Pedro Alonso back into the spotlight and introduced an entirely new group of characters around him. And the story isn't stopping there. Netflix has announced another Berlin adventure, Berlin and the Lady with the Ermine, continuing the character's story. So think about that for a second. A character who died years ago has now become the center of an expanding television universe. That's not just popularity. That's cultural impact. Pedro Alonso has also continued exploring his creative side through painting and writing, making his career much broader than acting alone. And unlike Berlin, who loved showing off his wealth and lifestyle, Alonso tends to keep much of his personal life away from the spotlight, which, honestly, might be the healthier choice. But Berlin wasn't the only major character introduced through the expanded story. Season 4 also brought a completely different kind of criminal into the gang, a man with a very different personality and a very big personality. 5. Hovik Keuchkerian. Bogotá didn't need much introduction. The moment he appeared, you knew exactly what kind of person he was. Confident, physical, loud when necessary, and absolutely comfortable around danger. Hovik Keuchkerian brought a completely different energy to the gang. He wasn't trying to replace Berlin. He wasn't trying to become the professor. He was simply Bogotá. And that's what made the character work. His role became especially important as the Bank of Spain operation became more dangerous and the gang needed someone capable of handling heavy physical work. But Bogotá also brought something the series always needed, a little humor in the middle of complete chaos. Hovik's real career is fascinating because acting wasn't the only thing he did. He began his professional life in other fields and eventually became a comedian and performer before building a successful acting career. That experience helped explain why Bogotá could switch between comedy and intense drama so naturally. After Money Heist, Hovik continued appearing in major Spanish and international productions. He's also become recognizable to audiences who may not even realize they first saw him in Money Heist. And that's the interesting thing about the later cast. They weren't simply background characters. They became part of the franchise's identity. But while Bogotá brought strength to the team, another new member brought something much more dangerous, a different kind of intelligence. 6. Rodrigo de la Serna.
Palermo
Was the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately make everyone uncomfortable. Not because he was physically intimidating, because you never knew what he was going to do. Played by Rodrigo de la Serna, Palermo was one of the professor's most important allies and Berlin's closest friends. His obsession with the heist was almost personal. For Palermo, this wasn't just a robbery, it was a masterpiece. And he wanted to be the person who helped create it. But that obsession also became his weakness. His temper, ego, and emotional connection to Berlin repeatedly put the operation at risk. Rodrigo de la Serna brought years of experience to the role. Long before Money Heist, he had already become internationally respected for playing Ernesto Che Guevara in The Motorcycle Diaries, a performance that earned major recognition. So when he arrived as Palermo, he wasn't some unknown actor suddenly discovered by Netflix. He was already an accomplished performer. Money Heist simply introduced him to another enormous audience. Since then, he has continued working across Latin American and international cinema. His career is a good example of something that often gets forgotten when people talk about Netflix stars. Sometimes the show doesn't create the actor's talent. It simply gives the talent a much bigger audience. And then came the character who turned the entire police operation upside down. Alicia Sierra. 7. Najwa Nimri. Alicia Sierra wasn't interested in playing by the rules, and that made her terrifying. Najwa Nimri's performance was one of the most memorable additions to the later seasons because Sierra wasn't a typical villain. She wasn't calm, she wasn't predictable, and she certainly wasn't afraid of getting her hands dirty. Her psychological battle with the professor became one of the most entertaining parts of the series. She understood how he thought. He understood how she thought. And every conversation between them felt like two chess players trying to predict the other's next move. Najwa Nimri was already a major Spanish actress and singer before Money Heist. She had appeared in films and television for decades, and her role as Zulema in Vis-a-Vis had already earned her a huge following. So Sierra wasn't her first complicated character. But it may have been the role that introduced her to the largest global audience. After Money Heist, she continued appearing in major Spanish productions and remained one of the most distinctive performers in the cast. Her music career is another part of her story that many international fans may not know about. She's released music under the name Najwa, giving her a career that stretches across both acting and music. And that makes her particularly interesting, because while Alicia Sierra was fighting the professor, Najwa Nimri had already been fighting stereotypes about what a Spanish actress could become for years. But Sierra wasn't the only person putting pressure on the professor. Inside the police command center, another man was making decisions, Luis Tamayo. 8. Fernando Cayo. Luis Tamayo wasn't a field agent, he was a commander, and that meant every decision he made could affect hundreds of lives. Played by Fernando Cayo, Luis Tamayo became one of the central faces of the government's response to the Bank of Spain robbery. Unlike Sierra, Tamayo was more controlled. He cared about appearances, he cared about authority. And most importantly, he cared about winning. That made him a very different kind of opponent for the professor. Fernando Cayo had already built a long career in Spanish film, television, and theater before Money Heist. He was never the loudest celebrity in the cast, but he was an experienced performer who could make a supporting role feel important. And that's exactly what happened with Tamayo. As the series became increasingly chaotic, his character represented the pressure coming from the official side of the story. The gang could improvise, the professor could manipulate, but Tamayo had an entire government machine behind him. That made the conflict much bigger than a simple robbery. And then there was Marseille, a character who could walk into an impossible situation and somehow make it look easy. 9. Luca Parrish. Marcella Marseille wasn't the loudest member of the team. He didn't need to be. He was calm, reliable. And when the professor needed someone to execute a difficult part of the plan, Marseille was usually the guy you wanted nearby. Luca Peros brought a quiet confidence to the role that made Marseille instantly likable. And here's something many viewers may not know. Luca Peros was born in Croatia and built an international acting career that eventually took him into Spanish productions. That's part of what made Money Heist so special. It wasn't simply a Spanish cast anymore. It was becoming an international ensemble. Actors from different countries, backgrounds, and careers were coming together inside the same fictional world. After the series became a global success, Luca continued appearing in international productions, proving that Marseille was only one chapter of his career. But there was still one final character we need to talk about, someone who had been around the story longer than many viewers realized. And by season 4, she finally became part of the gang. 10. Belen Kakesta. Manila's story is one of the most interesting additions to the later seasons. She wasn't simply another new criminal. She had a personal connection to Denver and Moscow, and her journey into the gang came with years of history behind it. Played by Belen Cuesta, Manila had already been living undercover among the hostages before revealing her true identity. That reveal completely changed how viewers understood some of the earlier scenes. And it also gave Belen Cuesta the opportunity to play a character who could move between vulnerability and confidence. Before Money Heist, Belen was already a respected Spanish actress, especially known for comedy and dramatic roles. Her performance in The Endless Trench earned her major recognition, including the Goya Award for Best Actress. So when she joined Money Heist, she was bringing much more experience than viewers might have realized. After the series, she continued working across Spanish film and television. And that's really the story of this entire cast. Some actors became global celebrities. Some became even bigger stars in Spain. Some moved into international productions. And some quietly continued building impressive careers away from the spotlight. But season 4 wasn't really about where the characters came from. It was about how much they were willing to lose. Nairobi, Rio, Lisbon. The professor, everyone was being pushed toward a breaking point. And that's why season 4 remains one of the most emotional chapters of Money Heist. Season 4 changed the tone of Money Heist. The jokes were still there. The red jumpsuits were still there. The impossible plans were still there. But the consequences felt much heavier. The characters were no longer just trying to escape with money. They were trying to protect each other. And sometimes that meant making decisions that couldn't be undone. Behind those characters were 10 actors who took the series from a Spanish crime drama to a worldwide phenomenon. And years later, their careers continued to move in completely different directions. Some returned to the Money Heist universe. Others moved into Hollywood and international productions. And some simply kept doing what they had been doing all along, making great Spanish cinema and television. That's what makes a "Where Are They Now?" story worth watching. Because the credits may have rolled, but the actors' stories never stopped. After watching all 10 journeys, which Money Heist Season 4 character is still your favorite? Tokyo? The Professor? Lisbon? Berlin? Or maybe one of the newer faces like Palermo, Bogotá, Marseille, or Manila? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoyed this trip back into the world of Money Heist, subscribe to the channel. We're not finished yet. There are still plenty of legendary movies, shows, and unforgettable casts waiting for us. Until the next video. Bella ciao.